It's very odd that, in my opinion, we don't ask very often, and we don't ask often enough. It is, I think, the holy grail of so many Jewish educators to do something called enhance their students' Jewish identity, or to give them a Jewish identity. According to my research, the phrase arose in the 60s, and I think it was probably a reaction to two things. It was a reaction, number one, to the idea of religion being too narrow or perhaps too inconvenient a model for Jewish engagement, or a descriptor for Jewish engagement. And it was also, it was also, sorry, threw me off the stride there. It was also in response to ever-growing numbers of assimilation and disappearing Jews, particularly in America. After the war, the fate of the Jewish people seemed to be to continue to decline through assimilation. And research showed that those Jews who were connected to some Jewish identity were less likely to assimilate. And therefore, the task became to give them that Jewish identity. But what is Jewish identity? When we say we are striving to give our students Jewish identity, when we say, as we do in this school, that a mark of our success is that our students should leave our school with their Jewish identity enhanced, what do we mean by that? And what are the success criteria by which we can measure whether we achieve that objective? And to be honest, I think we, like most of us, don't have an answer to that question. And we're prepared to include in this idea of Jewish identity all sorts of things that will make us feel that we've achieved our objective. And if we want to measure Jewish identity by A, something that's real and something has real Jewish content, and B, maybe a secondary measure, but an important one nevertheless, something that will help ensure Jewish continuity, help ensure the Jewish future, we have to ask ourselves, to what extent are our models of Jewish identity doing that? Now, historically, going back a long, long time, the question didn't need to be asked. The question wasn't asked. In fact, it probably wasn't the concept of Jewish identity. What was a Jew, or what did a Jew do that looked Jewish before the Enlightenment, before the Haskalah, going back about 250 years? Generally speaking, a Jew did Jewish things. They did religious things. That was what Jews did. And then, over the last 200 years, we've had different models of Jewish identity. Let me tell you, as a principal of a Jewish school, sometimes when I'm doing my principal stuff with other principals, they have a very funny idea of what a Jewish school would be. And certainly in the UK, where I used to work, and to some extent here, I often have to realize that when I say I'm the principal of a Jewish school, some of my non-Jewish colleagues have a concept that all we do all day is pray and do Jewish stuff. Because obviously if you've got a Jewish school, it must be very, very Jewish, full of very, very Jewish things. And I have to explain that no, this school and many Jewish schools are not like that. There are clearly some elements of Jewish life within the school, and there are plenty that are not, and because a lot of the students in my school, for instance, would not describe themselves as religious. And the concept of a non-religious Jew, for some people who haven't really sort of thought about the case, doesn't really compute. Because how can you be a Jew if you're not religious? Because after all, if Judaism means a religion, then how can you have a non-Jewish member of a non-religious member of the Jewish religion? It's a bit of a conundrum. It doesn't seem to make sense. Now, for us, it's not such a conundrum, because we know that there is this tremendous dichotomy running through Jewish history, running through Jewish philosophy. Are we a religion or are we a people? We can go back to the Rambam says we're more on the side of the religion, the Ramban errs more on the side of the people, up to modern times Rav Hirsch errs more on the side of the religion, Rav Kook more on the side of the people. But for all of them, there's a continuum. For all of them, we're a bit of both. And if one has one without the other, that's still okay because that's how it works. It's strange. It doesn't really make sense. And the truth is, it doesn't really make sense. We're certainly not a race. Maybe we're a people, whatever that means. We're certainly not just a religion. We're certainly more than that. We all sort of feel it somehow works, but it's a hard concept. And if one tries to analyze it Scientifically, I think one finds a difficulty. By the way, in very recent times, and I don't want to dwell on this, the association of Jews with Israel, which some use positively and some use negatively, I think is part of that same conundrum. What does it mean to be a Jew? Does it automatically mean one's connected to the state of Israel? I think most of us would say, well, it certainly should be. But then we don't want that to be used against us by some of our enemies. I think that's part of the same conundrum. So, having said it's a difficult matter, having said it's a question that we don't normally ask, let me tell you how some other people have answered the question. There's a gentleman called Ed Miliband, who is the leader of the opposition in Great Britain. Leader of Labour, he might be the next Prime Minister. He's Jewish and quite open about it. He says he's a friend of Israel. Turns out he's a funny sort of friend, but that's another story. He's Jewish. He has, I think, 3 children. His wife is not Jewish. But he, in an interview where he talked about his Jewishness, he said he did want to pass on his Jewish identity to his children. One can argue whether that's necessary in this particular case, but that's what he wanted to do. And he said, that means, wait for it, Yiddish curses, Woody Allen films, and chicken soup. That to him was what was meant by Jewish identity. And we chuckle at that, and that's what you're supposed to do, thank you very much. But when the Pew report, when the Pew researchers asked American jury, the report that came out late last year, what are the key things about being Jewish? 73% said keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive. 56% said seeking social justice. Now it's very interesting that those were the largest denominators of Jewish identity in the United States. They are no doubt worthy of passes. But they're not something that's uniquely Jewish. They're not something that you have to be Jewish to do. Do you have to be Jewish to enjoy chicken soup? Probably not, but it helps. Do you have to be Jewish to seek social justice? Certainly not. Do you have to be Jewish to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive? Certainly not. 42% answered the question by saying having a good sense of humor was the distinguishing feature of being Jewish. As if 3,000 years of heritage and scholarship can be devoted to one episode of Seinfeld, and that's all you need to do to be Jewish. By the way, when I repeat that to some people, they say, I don't get it. What's funny about being Jewish? But apparently in America, they're associated.
Only 42% will understand.
Okay. What models do we give our students? What models do we give our community? Danny, hello. You're here.
Yes, sir.
Okay, Danny was last year the president of the Executive Council of Australian Jury. And you took issue with me over a comment I made about the ECAJ's review of last year that they sent out. Well, I've already done it in public and you've already reported to me. I didn't know you were going to be sitting in this session. The ECAJ gave a review of their activities over the last year, coming up to Rosh Hashanah at the end of last year. And they listed 18 things that they've done. And 15 of them were about fighting Holocaust denial, fighting anti-Semitism, and fighting anti-Zionism. And I took issue with what message that sends, because to me it sends a horribly negative message. That Jewish identity is about fighting against things, it's about victimhood, it's about defining ourselves by the people who don't like us. And to me that's a terrible message to be sending. Now Danny did tell me that the ECAJ did lots and lots of other things, and I know that's the case. But it was still nevertheless interesting that in presenting our achievements this year, so many of them were about fighting that sense of victimhood. And I think a lot of the Jewish identity we give to our young people is that if you're Jewish, you're a victim. If you're Jewish, then Jewish history means rivers of blood and pogroms culminating in the Holocaust, and it's still going on because they still hate us. That may be true, by the way, but the picture that we give our young people, I think, is predominantly negative, and the positive bits are maybe chicken soup, and I say that seriously because a lot of people identify bits of food or bits of Friday night as part of their Jewish identity. And here's the greatest irony in my opinion, Part of Jewish identity is the need to maintain a Jewish identity. And that's supposed to be as recursive as it sounds, without explaining to our young people what and why. I think there's a phenomenon, I think it's actually less in Melbourne and maybe more in other cities, in one other capital in particular, of the students who come out of our Jewish school systems and report that they are Jewed out. And I have to say, I used to be very critical and very judgmental about the idea of being Jewed out. Being Jewed out, I understand, is an excuse for running away from Jewish activity and running towards non-Jewish activity and non-Jewish social life, etc., etc. And students say, you know, it's not our fault. We've been stuck in this Jewish environment for 15 years and now we're Jewed out. As I say, I used to be quite judgmental. I used to say things like, if I want to eat chocolate, which I do, and I will binge on chocolate, hopefully not very often, I'm not going to say that I'm binging on chocolate because of all those nutritional health messages that I've been given and it's their fault. I binge on chocolate because I like chocolate, and I think those who find excuses to run away from their Jewish connections and their Jewish engagement are just looking for an excuse. But having said that, if their Jewish identity has been lacking coherence, lacking some sort of intellectual theoretical underpinning, and if their Jewish identity has just been consisting of A, you're a victim, B, you eat funny food from time to time, and C, in a circular fashion, you've got to maintain a Jewish identity, I don't blame people for finding a considerable lack in that sort of package. And saying, if that's what being Jewish is, well then, frankly, I'm Jewed out, and I want to look for something more attractive, and something that makes more sense. So, to sum up where I've got to, it seems to me that we don't have a coherent answer to this question. We talk about Jewish identity without having ways of measuring what that means, or how successful we should be. If, by the way, part of the ways we measure success is Jewish continuity, and part of the ways we measure Jewish continuity is the level of intermarriage, well then, we're not doing very well. In America, which is always ahead of us, intermarriage amongst the youngest age group that are marrying is about 65%. In Australia, in the youngest age group, it's 40%, so we're much better off, but obviously we're not better off. We're not in a very good state either. Let me throw it open to you. I said in my opening remarks yesterday, Halamed b'kol adam, someone who learns from everyone is wise. So I'm very happy to make this session into an interactive one and ask all the experts in the room, how do they understand Jewish identity? And how do you convey to your students what are the components of Jewish identity? And what would be your success criteria for having succeeded in doing that? Yes, Rabbi Avila. Alison.
That's okay. I'm going to answer your question with a question. Do you actually think there is only one definition or one example of a Jewish identity that can be defined and measurable by the same set of criteria among all Jews?
Okay. I'm going to give my answer to the question. I'm going to give what happens to be my personal answer to the question, and I hope you'll agree it's fairly broad and encompassing. I wouldn't necessarily use the P word, but I'll say it's broad and encompassing. I think there are certain... We've had a good chat already today. I think there are certain criteria, certain components which are an essential part of Jewish identity. And in my opinion, missing one of those components is a deficient Jewish identity. But I also think there are different ways of incorporating those components. Okay? What would you say?
In terms of answering my question or your question? My question, I don't think that there are the same criteria for everyone necessarily. It's a good question. I didn't raise my hand to answer that one.
Okay. What I think there are certain irreducible components.
What's that?
I think there are certain irreducible components, which I will share with you at some stage.
Okay.
Okay? Yes?
Do you know Avraham Infeld's five-legged table model? Because for me, that allows a broad definition of Jewish identity. And he says if you can identify with any we'll never have uniformity, but we can have unity if we identify with three of the five components. And I find when I present that to the students, it allows them to have their own sense of identification without feeling pigeonholed.
And what are the 5?
Okay. Memory.
Google.
So one is
So can you say again, who's the author of this?
Abraham Infeld. He says, your people are my people. That's what Ruth says first. Your God is my God. So peoplehood.
No. Sorry.
Sorry.
It's not the first one.
No, not in any particular order. So correct me if I'm wrong. So an identification with the people, an identification with the Torah as the text, an identification with language, with land, and with memory.
Okay, as it happens, it's very close to mine, it's probably more poetically expressed. But I would ask, what does it mean to identify with people? How does a student actually manifest that themselves in their lives? You see, part of my problem is that a lot of what we... First of all, as I said, I don't think we ask the question enough. I don't think we really bother to answer the question. And when we do answer the question, sometimes we do it in very vague ways. And we don't give actual tools to our students to go out and do something. Now, what does... Sorry to put you on the spot. You don't have to feel on the spot. What does identifying with people mean? Now, a student can walk down the street and say, yeah, I identify with the Jewish people. Is that what we're looking for? How should they translate that from theory into practice? And I think that's part of the question we have to ask as well. And we have to give our students tools to make that translation, if it's going to be something that's real.
Just saying, Kol Yisrael Rovim Zeh Lezeh, isn't that exemplifying that or summarizing it?
Kol Yisrael Rovim Zeh Lezeh. Every Jew is responsible for one another. So does that mean that we want, if that's one of the 3 legs which they're going to adopt as their own, does that mean that every time a Jew is in trouble, our student must somehow help them out of that trouble?
Respond.
Well, that's, you see that's actually quite a tall order. There are 14 million Jews in the world. A lot of them right now are in trouble. Should our students be responding? And if not, are they failing to identify with the people? And how are they going to respond? Does that mean, and I'm not saying this facetiously, does that mean if there's a Jew in Colorado who is got a problem, it becomes my problem? And if I don't respond to that, I'm failing my connection to the people? Or is it only when there's a lot of Jews? Or is it only Jews in Israel? Etc. I'm not sure I've got answers to these questions, but I think they're important questions. Yes?
My husband, who is an atheist, and I'm going to give a very simplistic way, I said, what do you think you're Jewish? He said, because my father is Jewish, my mother is Jewish. Settled. That's it. That's his explanation for being Jewish.
Now, a lot of our students might answer in the same way. But do we want more from our students than that? Do we want more from our students as just who their parents happen to be, but rather who they happen to be? I think we do. Yes?
I think it might go back to the old story of Judaism being an active religion, where a person is encouraged to do things rather than just believe. I think maybe the key to it is to actually go and do something. Say we use those 5 pillars there, about those 5 pillars, as opposed to just having a warm and fuzzy feeling inside saying, oh, I'm Jewish. That's a bit of a problem with word identity, that id word, it's all about me or how I feel. But it's not. It's about, well, if you're, one of the pillars is belief in Torah, well, go and do something about it. Go and learn some Torah. If it's about the land of Israel, go visit it. Go give money to it. If it's about the people of Israel, go and help your neighbor. Go and visit the city. It's doing something as opposed to being passive.
I think I want to quote an idea from a fellow British educator, someone who I don't always agree with, but I have a lot of respect for, called Clive Lawton, whom you all know. And he once said to me that when they picked the term, I think it was in the 60s, they picked the wrong term. Instead of Jewish identity, they should have talked about Jewish identification. And the same Clive Lawton once wrote a pamphlet called Judaism is not an ism, it's an is. And I think both of those clever quotes sum up what you were saying, and I passionately believe that part of the problem is what actually I was alluding to in my interrogation there. Part of our problem is that we often sort of relegate Jewish identity to the heart, or maybe even to the mind. And it should be something active. Now, I say that for two reasons. Okay, no pretense, I'm a rabbi. Okay, I have a certain religious perspective to this, and I think mitzvot are a good idea. And I think Jews should be doing Jewish things. But as an educator, if we want our lessons to take root, then the theoretical has to be translated into the active. Or to put another way, from a social studies point of view, what the Pew Report found very clearly is the best guarantor of Jewish continuity is not being Jewish, but doing Jewish. It's Jewish behavior. And Jewish behavior is something beyond Jewish identity, or can be if Jewish identity is just something in the mind and in the heart. If we want our students to make their Judaism real, in some sense, in whatever sense, and I'm trying not to be particularly denominational here, if we want it to be something that's real, it's got to be translated into action. Now, that action can take many forms, and that's part of what I'm trying to discuss here. But it's got to move from the heart into something practical. Yes?
But I also think you can't identify with something that you don't know. So if you don't know about, if you want to identify with Jewish people, but you don't know what that people have done or have been through, you can't identify with them. So before you get to action, you need to know what that action needs to be in order for that to be a Jewish action.
So we need Jewish educators. So we've got a job.
We've all got a job.
That's good. We've got jobs. But you're absolutely right. The Jewish action needs to be based on Jewish knowledge. There's no doubt about it. And you can say that just from a sociological point of view or from a religious point of view. There's a reason why we say Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. There's a reason why Jews always built schools before they built anything else. There's a reason why we kept going, even despite having no land and no army and no government, because we had Jewish education. But still, that education has to be a precursor to action. Yes?
I would just like to argue that Jewish identity is a chameleon, in the sense that, on the one hand, the action is a really incredible part of it, and you're demanded to do a lot. But if you go and strip it down to its basics, Jewish identity is the easiest thing. It's easier than Christian or Muslim identity. And the reason I say that is I was on an interfaith board, and I remember looking at this pamphlet they gave out where it asked, to be belonging to your religion, do you have to believe in God? And so for Christians, the answer is yes. For Muslims, the answer is yes. And for Jewish, the answer is no. Because the bottom line of Judaism is you're in just because your mum is. And essentially, based on that, Har Sinai made a change in the people, in the sense that prior to Har Sinai, Avram could give birth to a Jew and a non-Jew, so to speak. But once Har Sinai happened, you're Jew, and that's it. You're born to. So Jewish identity is actually you have to do to zero, and I think that's an important point because that means everyone's in. Then the second step is you want to be a fulfilled Jew. Well, you've got to do a lot more than a Muslim or a Christian because you've got crazy obligations. So there's this kind of incredible responsibility and also no responsibility.
Which is a little bit, I mean, it's another way of saying, I think, what I said, but we have this continuum between people and religion. And the answer is we're bits of both. And that's absolutely true from a philosophical point of view, it's absolutely true. I think from an educational point of view, it's very dangerous. Because but the problem is this, that we have lots of kids today who, yes, they know they're Jewish because their mother and father were Jewish, or because they go to a Jewish school, or because they do certain bits and pieces. But in this particular day and age, where Jews have more choices than ever before, and staying in the Jewish community, which is measured by marrying Jewish, amongst other things, is no longer the default position. We have to give them very positive reasons for staying Jewish. I've talked many times before about why be Jewish, and this is another angle on the same discussion. It's not enough. It's absolutely correct to say, yes, you're born Jewish, therefore you have a Jewish identity. That's absolutely correct. But from an educational point of view, it's so far removed from what we need to give them. Yes?
What he actually said, I thought was interesting. He said the other side of the coin is that they need to be fulfilled as Jews. And I think that word is a very, very important word. Obviously, the students that are leaving and becoming assimilated, they're not being fulfilled, in which case we need to question why they're not being fulfilled. What are we missing out that they are not being fulfilled?
Well, that's a slightly different question, and I've spoken on that before, so I didn't want to speak on that again. That's the Judaism, or the Jewish engagement that we present to them, has to be, in my opinion, beautiful and meaningful, and on some level true, as in intellectually coherent. And if we fail to make it beautiful and meaningful and true, they're quite likely and almost entitled to say, I don't need it, I don't want any part of it. That's the fulfillment that I think we as educators have to project to them. But that's a slightly different question to what is the basic tools or the basic components of Jewish identity. If a student says, I got a Jewish identity, or more or better, if we say we're good in our school because we give our kids a Jewish identity, how exactly should we measure that? That's, to me, the question I'm trying to answer. Yes?
I want to say that ironically, we have now a lab to test that, because Israel is where you have the biggest challenge. Because in Israel, marrying Jew is a default, still a default. Now, if you take Israeli teens today and ask them about their Jewish identity, if they come from the secular system that 82% of them comes from, they won't have a good answer to you.
What's our answer to the big?
I think that they will speak about their Israeli identity and relate that to what it is that you're asking them, because in most cases they don't even have the language, which is the biggest problem on the Israeli side. But I think it's interesting because you're talking about, and you are naturally referring to, communities outside of Israel, and I'm listening to you through the Israeli ear, and what I'm hearing, which is what I've already, I know as a Jewish educator that works internationally, that the biggest Jewish identity problem today relies, and again, sorry, I'm Israeli, so in my perspective, and I'm thinking about the future of this, this project, which is still a project, is mainly on our side.
It's interesting. That's a very interesting perspective. And of course, you said it correctly. The difference is marrying Jewish and staying Jewish is the default, which is why people are searching for the question. They don't really even see the need to ask the question, to the extent that I think we do feel the need to ask the question. We're just not sure of the answer. But there is a particular test case where you can see what you're saying in a very real way, in a very sad way, and that is Israelis outside of Israel. For instance, in Melbourne, there's lots of Israelis outside of Israel. There's a large Israeli community. Generally speaking, they do not connect to the Jewish community. And I hope I'm not being too judgmental or just wrong, because I think they often don't feel the need to connect to the Jewish community, because after all, they've got their Israeli identity. And what they don't realize is their children won't have that Israeli identity, and they'll have nothing left. I have to tell you, I recently had a very inspiring moment when a prospective parent came to the school. And we always meet prospective parents, and I always ask them, what brings you here? And this was an Israeli family who put their children in the non-Jewish school system. And can we turn that off? Thank you. And she said to me, the reason I'm here is because I always go to the Yom HaZikaron event, the Melbourne Yom HaZikaron event, because her uncle totally free war. And this year she brought her children, and she suddenly realized that her children didn't understand why she was there, because they didn't have a connection to Yom HaZikaron. So we're talking about an Israeli part of Israeli identity. And therefore she said, I've got to put them in a Jewish school. And I said to her, it's such a beautiful story, I was really quite overcome. I said, that's why we're here. That's why a school like this is here. But she's one of the lucky ones. Because I think you're absolutely right. I hope I'm not saying anything insensitive. It's the Israelis who don't understand, I'm making a gross generalization, the need for a positive Jewish identity. And when they come outside Israel, that need is very acute, and sometimes it passes them by. Yes?
I want to pick up on a couple of things. I'm building on your point that you can't, one of the ways to display Jewish identity is that you can't be a good Jew on a mountaintop, even with the Torah with you. You have to be connected to a community. So one of the ways we've been reframing what we might offer as an outcome is to say that we're giving you building blocks to live a connected Jewish life, which means that you are actively connected to some part of the Jewish community. And what that will look like will be different for different kids if we want to address the fulfillment issue. But what I found with the Israeli families that I work with is that one of the difficulties for them about envisaging enrolling in a Jewish class is that it feels inauthentic to them because their family has never been religious. So they're struggling with how do I create a Jewish identity for my family in diaspora that is inauthentic to what our home life is like. But one of the things that the Israelis still do here, from my experience, is they still get the tribe part. They might not hang out with the entire Jewish community, but they're often still hanging out together.
And one of the things that indicates to me that someone's living a connected Jewish life is that they're hanging out with other Jews. Like, they're hanging out as a tribe, whether they're part of an adult Maccabi team or they're something else, they're hanging out.
I think that's true, but at the risk of being pessimistic, I would say that's of limited likelihood. Because, and I think studies show, that tribal identity, if it's only a tribal identity, is hard to pass to the children and impossible to pass to the grandchildren.
No, but that's what the peoplehood leg feels like to me, rather than, you know, if you can't raise money for every Jew in Arizona who gets, you know, God forbid, shot up in a school, you know, that you're...
I think there's two separate things there, and I think it's important we don't confuse the two. There's hanging out with other Jews.
Yeah.
And then there's feeling a sense of connection to the Jewish people. And the difference is, I might hang out with a bunch of mates who happen to be Jewish and I've got more in common with them and, you know, they're Jewish and that sort of feels right. That is quite different from saying there's a Jew in New York, or there's lots of Jews in New York, or particularly Jews in Israel, and their troubles are my troubles, or their joys are my joys. That's identification, and that's quite different. And I do think it's good that Jewish kids hang out with other Jewish kids, not necessarily to the exclusion of non-Jewish associations, but I think it is good that they have a Jewish social life. But I'm saying, if that's all their Jewish identity means, then I'm looking to the future, and I'm not optimistic. Because there's no reason why their children want to hang out with Jewish kids, and certainly not their grandchildren. Because if it's just a tribal affinity, and they're here in this great melting pot, then the tribal affinity melts away. That's natural. It has to be backed up by some, or underpinned by something, which I think, I use the word coherence, and stimulated by some behavioural action, if it's going to be perpetuated. I am starting from the position, I think most people working for the community would share this, I know not everybody, that we want our kids to marry Jewish, we want our kids to stay Jewish, we want our kids to build Jewish families. And if that's an aim, then we have to give them the reasons, the positive reasons, and the inclinations to do so. And in this day and age, that's very hard, because there are so many other options. There was a hand up over here. Yes?
Going back to the education, from one side, as a result of wanting to be able to be proud of its culture from one way, and from going to the community and having in the small era, but what I want him as a potato is to have dialogue with the culture, with the people, and with scholars. So, be able to ask the question all the time.
So Jewish identity is to ask Jewish questions?
Yes.
Yes.
But in a special area.
Sorry?
I just defined it in special areas.
Such as? Sorry,
community, culture.
But to engage, to grapple with Jewish issues, and to engage with Jewish culture. Yes?
I think that you talk about choice, and in the world we've got so many choices nowadays, and I think if you look at the Book of Ruth and you look at her choice, because she made a choice to be Jewish, and I think the four things that, you know, that she was asked by her mother-in-law, to me, is the, I would say that's the paradigmatic model for how to be Jewish. You know, wherever you go, I will go. I'm with the Jewish people. I'm going to support them. I'm going to be with them. I may argue, I may fight behind the scenes, but I'm with you. In Israel, where you live, I will live. You have to live among Jews. You can't live on a mountain. You have to be with Jewish people. You have to do Jewish. And your God shall be my God. However we interpret that, however we interpret how to do religiousness or how to connect to God, I think that's individual, but I think that we have that connection with God is crucial. And I do think that where you die, I will die, is also, it's a lifetime commitment. It's from birth to death, you know, that I'm going to be with you that whole way. And I think that you're right, it has to be with connections, fulfillment, and through action and belief. But I think it needs to be somewhat broad as long as you're with the community that way.
Okay, thank you. Let me give you my answer to the question. For what it's worth, and I don't suggest it's any more valuable than anybody else's. And it's quite similar to your 5 pillars, but slightly different. And it also includes one element that nobody else has mentioned. And the first thing I would say is, exactly as many people have said, identification with the Jewish people. And to me that means a sense of feeling connection, and a sense of what happens to Jews elsewhere in the world is somehow connected to me. And that means Jews in America, and that means Jews in China, and Jews in South Africa, and Jews all over the world, and especially the place which is the center of Jewish life, which is the Jewish homeland, which is Israel. For reasons because A, there are 6 million Jews living there, and B, because it is the centre of Jewish life. What happens in Israel is something that I feel connected to. Maybe I'll go and live in Israel. Or maybe when I open the newspaper, for those who still read newspapers, I will look for the Israel stories. And so, or anything in between. Sorry?
It's the front page.
Yeah, it's usually the front page. Or anything in between. That's what I call identification with the Jewish people across geographical boundaries. And if I'm just identifying with my Jewish mates around me, I don't call that identifying with the Jewish people. That means Jewish people whom I don't know, whom we're never going to meet, but I'm connected to because I am Jewish. And it also means connecting with the Jewish past and the Jewish future. It means understanding that I, as a Jew, am the bearer of a heritage, which is 3,500 years. And by the way, it's not all bad stuff. It's not all about blood and persecution. It's lots and lots of good stuff. And of course, and I'm setting this up deliberately, I need to learn about my Jewish history. I need to learn about where I've come from. I need to learn about the Jewish contribution to the world and the Jewish contribution to the Jews. I need to know what it is to be a link in a chain or a page in a book, whatever metaphor one wants, that has gone before me. And I need to be committed to the Jewish future. I need to understand that what happens to Jews somehow affects me. That there's something called Jewish destiny. That there are things that are going to happen to the Jewish people, and I am part of that. And more than that, I can turn fate into destiny because I can actually play a part in that Jewish future. On one level, I can build Jewish life and I can build Jewish lives. And on a different level, I can actually contribute to the development of the State of Israel. I can contribute to the development of my community. I can set up institutions. I can work with other people. I have a responsibility, I have an opportunity, and I should do something for the sake of the Jewish people. And in particular, perhaps, to ensure that there's another generation of Jews and I can play my part in that. So that's what I mean by Jewish peoplehood. That's what I mean by being connected to the Jewish people. Having that sense of Jewish history and Jewish destiny, and having that sense of connection to Jews all around the world, and that their fate somehow is connected to mine. But here's an element which, funny enough, nobody mentioned, which I think is crucial, but a lot of people don't, and that is to speak a language of the Jewish people. There is something that connects us, and it's called Hebrew, or Hebrew. It used to be, for a small part of Jewish people, Yiddish was the way, the international language. And for other parts of Jewish people, it was Judeo-Arabic or Latino. But Hebrew always was, and certainly today is, the means of communication amongst Jews around the world. We all know stories. I had to arrange a trip to a sort of sister school in Paris. And I'm English, so of course I don't speak French. And he was French, so of course he didn't speak English. But we communicated in Hebrew. Neither of us were natural speakers. But that was the obvious choice that we were going to use to communicate with each other. But more to the point, Hebrew is the gateway. It's the gateway to Jewish liturgy, and it's the gateway to Jewish literacy, and it's the gateway to Jewish scholarship. And without some connection, at least an ability to read, and preferably much more than that, without some connection to the very building blocks of Jewish literacy, I think a Jewish identity is deficient. Which brings me on to my next point. And that is a connection to what I think is the authenticity of what some people call Jewish culture, but I call something else. To me, and I'll be controversial here, I think a lot of what passes for Jewish culture is actually what we picked up from host communities around the world, normally about 20 years after they've dropped it. I think that applies to Jewish music, it applies to Jewish food, it applies to Jewish dress, it applies to some aspects of Jewish literature. What's the irreducible core? What's the authentic, in my opinion? Okay, I'm being a rabbi, no apologies. That I think a connection to the classical sources of Judaism is part of a Jewish identity. And I think for a Jew to be unfamiliar with the basic sources of the classical sources of Judaism is also a lack in the Jewish identity. Now, I'm probably moving from essentials to desirable characteristics, but I don't think this is anything other than essential. I think for a Jew, certainly somebody coming out of our schools, our youth movements, who has no connection to classic Jewish literature, I think we have failed to give that young person a sense of Jewish identity. Because only with that connection can they really draw on the root of what it means to be Jewish. I don't think Woody Allen counts. Because Woody Allen's not going to give you a great sense of Jewish identity. It's not going to help perpetuate your Jewish identity to the next generation. It's not going to make your sense of being Jewish real. And it's not very good, that's another matter. I think one has to connect on some level to the classical sources of Judaism. And that goes back to what I said about knowing Hebrew. Because one needs to have that gateway open to one in order to access that Jewish history. Yes?
I don't disagree with you about that, but
Thank you.
I don't necessarily disagree. But I'm wondering who is going to provide the means for people, not just students at schools like this, or any of our day schools, but for people from, say, 18 to, God forbid, in the 60s, so that we can, because there seems to be a complete dearth of ability to find places to teach us.
Well, I don't know if there's a dearth of ability, but there's certainly a lack of will and lack of resources, and lack of funding, and lack of institutions, and lack of lots of things. I mean, you've got me on another hobby box now, and I'm looking at my watch, but I've got a few minutes to just write on my hobby box. In our community, just one moment, I'll come back to you. In our community, we are brilliant at providing schools and youth groups. And we pour in vast amounts of money, not we, but parents, by the way, parents collectively pour in vast amounts of money. And I'm very glad that they do. I think Jewish schools are a good thing, and they pay my mortgage. I think that's a good thing. From the age of 18 to 30, and in particular, perhaps we give a little bit in the university years, but from early 20s to 30, we give almost nothing in terms of Jewish provision, and particularly educational Jewish provision. And although the years in school are critical and they help form Jewish identity, help form an identity, we hope it's a Jewish identity, the 20-somethings is precisely when they're making those critical life choices about what sort of long-term life they're going to have, and in particular what sort of families they're going to build. And we in our community here give them almost nothing. And I think this is not only a tragedy, it's a crisis. And I think we need to do so much more. It comes down to money. We need to invest, we need to prioritize, we need to train, we need to appoint people who can educate, stimulate, lead that age group. So I agree. I think it is a priority, and I think we ignore it at our peril, and we are ignoring it.
Who should be providing this at the schools, the ZFA, the university?
All of the above. I have to say, and the best answer I can give is the community. The problem is, and I don't want to get too much of this, certainly in Melbourne, the community doesn't exist. There's no address of the community, and there should be. So that's another problem about the way the community works. But I agree with your sentiment perfectly. Yes. Yes. Okay. I promised I'd come back to you.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to be direct as an Israeli. I can't go the other way.
So that's part of Israeli identity,
yes,
to be direct.
Yes. And by the way, I totally agree with you about Israelis that are living in the diaspora. I experienced it myself with my family, but I want to ask you, as a Hebrew teacher and as the principal of a Jewish school, if you think that Hebrew and Jewish studies is so vital for the identity of being a Jew, why don't you give at least half a day of Hebrew and Jewish studies in your school?
I was maybe because I'm not Israeli, I've said to a few people when I've asked them a question, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you obviously are happy to put me on the spot.
I'm fine.
Yeah, but I'm very much on the spot. Why don't we have at least half the day of Jewish studies and Hebrew in a school, in my school? Well, there are a number of answers to that, but first of all I'll say there are some schools that do that. There are some schools that have half, there are some schools that have more than half. They're the ones that get closed down by the government, but there are some schools that do that. I think the answer is pragmatic. one has to balance the needs of the curriculum. We have to operate now all under the Australian curriculum, which takes up a lot of time. We obviously, somebody called out about parents, we obviously have to satisfy our customers, and we have to pitch our offering as something that our customers will want to endorse and pay for. And each school has to understand its market, and I think that's a polite way of saying what's obvious, that our parents wouldn't necessarily want a 50%. But I have to say, and I think this happens to be something our school does very, very well, the Jewish life of the school is much more than just the Jewish studies and Hebrew lessons. The Jewish life of the school is what goes on the walls. The Jewish life of the school is how the day and the week and the year are punctuated by the Jewish day, the Jewish week, the Jewish year, and all the, what we call the informal Jewish educational experiences. Our kids, it's interesting, because I talk to them a lot, they feel this school is very Jewish. They feel very strongly they go to a Jewish school. Too Jewish. Some of them might say it's too Jewish, but most of them don't. Most of them don't. And they feel that what they get, I'm talking about this school, but I'm sure many others achieve the same results, what they get from this school is a very strong Jewish life. I'll try and avoid the word Jewish identity for obvious reasons, but a very strong Jewish life. In the Jewish studies and Hebrew lessons and outside. So that's the best answer I can give you. Yes, sir?
I'm intrigued that the role of the synagogues hasn't even been mentioned. And in modern times it seems that synagogue or communal prayer generally is shrinking and shrinking, not just in the Jewish world, but the Christian world as well. Perhaps more so. Should we just give up? And concentrate on peoplehood and all the other good things
Well, no, but I don't disagree with your point. There's a reason why I chose to be a rabbi in a school and not a rabbi in a shul. I don't think we should give up on shuls, but I do think we need to realise, and I think in Australia we pretty much do realise this, in the UK where I came from we didn't, that schools fulfil the role, much of the role that used to be ascribed to shuls. The trouble with shuls, well there's a lot of trouble with shuls, is that the principal trouble with shuls is that it used to be, and I think we have moved away from this, that the gateway to Jewish involvement was through, not just through the shul, but through prayer. Now prayer, tefillah, is very hard. It's hard if you know what you're doing, and it's hard if you don't know what you're doing. It's pretty boring, especially if you're not really inclined. It's in a funny language, it's not just in Hebrew, it's in biblical Hebrew. It fails on all counts. And what you go to a shul for, predominantly, is to pray. You don't have to go every so often. Some people only go once a year, and interestingly enough, they pick the worst day of all to go and experience a day of shul. I never understood that. Many shuls, I think, are thinking outside the box and seeing themselves more as community centres, and providing a social environment, and especially providing an educational environment. But here in schools, and most of us work in schools, we have a captive audience. They have to come every day. If they don't, we get told off. They're with us 8 hours a day. Little ones are with us much more of their waking hours than they are with their parents. We have the opportunity to infuse them with the Jewish life and the Jewish experiences I was talking about earlier. We bring them into contact with hopefully charismatic and inspiring Jewish educators inside and outside the classroom. We have so many opportunities to enhance their Jewish identity in ways that I think we do understand after this session, in a way that shuls don't. So I wouldn't give up on shuls, but I would realise that the way we're really going to generate that continuity and that connection, that fulfillment of being Jewish, is probably not in shuls. Shuls are a part of that, but other things need to come into play. Primarily schools, and I say that because I like schools, but I actually think we perform a crucial role, but I would also add the adult education or the post-school education you're referring to. But let me just say, the reason I wouldn't give up on shuls is because my fifth and final point, lost count, Jewish connection, past, present, and future, and Jewish language and Jewish literacy, and there has to be some element of Jewish behaviour. Now, I'm not being prescriptive about what that is, but I do think it has to be connected to religious behaviour in some way, and I'm not being denominational. But I think a Jewish life which is devoid of Jewish behaviour, as I said earlier, is not going to be one to perpetuate. And when I say Jewish behaviour, I've already said I think it has to be connected to religion in some way. What I don't mean is something that's like a Jewish hobby. That my hobby is, sometimes I read books about rare birds, or I occasionally do Jewish things. Why is that not good enough? Because in final analysis, it's not going to be an imperative. If I have a hobby, but it might come one Sunday afternoon, I'm too busy to do it, so I won't do it. Our Judaism's got to be more important than that. And I would say to people, there are some people for whom they have a Jewish Friday night, and that's really important. And every week they have a Friday night. Unless Carlton is playing the MTG that Friday night. In which case, they go to watch the game. And what are they saying to themselves, and what are they saying to their children? They're saying that even our Jewish behaviour is not the most important thing in the world. That it comes second to other things. And the children learn from that. And when the children have to make critical life decisions, they understand that Judaism or Jewish engagement can come second to other things. So, I think my final of my pillars is some sort of Jewish behaviour, some sort of behaviour which is uniquely and authentically Jewish, and is critical in the sense that it's a Yerav Yavor. It always comes before anything else. People have to have in their lives something that they do which is Jewish, they will always do, but they won't give up on. And we as parents and we as teachers have to try and tell our students and our children, but there are some things which you do Jewishly, however inconvenient, and however many competing needs, and you keep doing them because they're Jewish. And there has to be something, it can be different for every person, it can come from a different source, but there has to be something that I will not give up on, however difficult. Because if there isn't that one thing, then nothing really matters. Then nothing can be said to be so important that I must do this because I'm Jewish. Yep.
Unfortunately, I think a lot of the times, the one thing that they insist on is to be buried as a Jew.
I must tell you, you give me a cue. There are some rabbis I'm tremendously envious of who have lots and lots of stories to tell. Things happen to them and they have stories to tell. I don't. But I have one, so I tell it very often. And it goes like this. In the UK where I come from, you have to register births and you have to register deaths. When there's a birth in the family, you have to go to the registry office to document it. And when there's a death in the family, you have to go to the registry office to have it documented. And I went to this registry office when my son was born, and he was jaundiced, as they always are, and therefore we didn't have the bris for 3 weeks, so I didn't have the name for 3 weeks. So I arrived, I didn't want to register without the name, obviously, so it took me 3 weeks to get to the registry office. And I came to the registry office and I explained why I was late. And it was in a Jewish area, a place called Manchester, and the registrar knew all about that. And she also knew that Jews bury the dead very quickly, so they have to hurry to get a death certificate issued, and they have to hurry to register the death. It's all part of what has been done. And they know that these people, in order to be buried in that way, have to get their death registered very quickly. So she's familiar with that. And she said to me the following. She said, Jews seem a lot more religious when they die than when they're born. And you're right. So let me conclude by saying, to me, sorry, I've run out of time. To me, the critical components of Jewish identity are connection with the Jewish people, the past and the present and the future, and their own responsibility in bringing that future about. An ability to connect to and preferably speak the language of the Jewish people. A connection with the classical and authentic literature of the Jewish people, and some degree of Jewish authentic and critical behaviour. And you're absolutely right, we should encourage our students to have that when they're alive and not when they're alive. Thank you very much.